Charles Spencer had been quiet for years. He attended the events and smiled at the right moments. He kept his feelings about Camilla where most people in his position keep things that burn, somewhere private and somewhere controlled. Then came the gathering, and something shifted inside him. He spoke directly, in front of the family that had broken his sister, and in front of the woman he held responsible for a significant part of that breaking. Catherine was standing just feet away, and she did something nobody expected from a future queen. She wept. What did Spencer say? And why did it hit Catherine that deeply? Let's find out. The man who never forgot. Charles Spencer has carried his sister's memory with a specific kind of weight that the public has only seen in fragments across the years. Most people remember the eulogy. September 6, 1997, Westminster Abbey. A young man standing at a podium in front of 2 billion people watching around the world, delivering words about his sister that were also unmistakably an indictment of the institution that had consumed her. He spoke about Diana's vulnerability and about the people who had exploited it. He spoke about her boys and what he intended to do to protect them. He spoke with a directness that no one inside that abbey had expected and that no one who heard it had forgotten. The royal family sat in the front pews and absorbed every word. That eulogy established something about Charles Spencer that has defined his public presence ever since. He is not someone who performs grief. He is someone who carries it with a precision that makes it more dangerous than any outburst could be. In the years that followed Diana's death, Spencer largely stepped back from public confrontation with the royal family. He gave interviews occasionally. He spoke about Diana's legacy at appropriate moments. He maintained the public presence expected of someone connected to one of the most significant figures in modern British history. But he did not openly challenge the people he held responsible for what happened to his sister. He did not use his platform to relitigate the decisions made inside the palace during Diana's marriage and after it. He observed the careful distance that someone in his position, with his history and his feelings, learns to maintain when direct confrontation serves no productive purpose. That restraint was not indifference. People who know Spencer describe him as someone who thinks carefully about when to speak and when to wait, someone who understands that timing matters as much as content when the words you are preparing to say have been building inside you for nearly 3 decades. His relationship with Camilla has never been publicly warm. That is an understatement of some significance. Spencer was present through the years of his sister's marriage. He watched Diana navigate a relationship with Charles that was being simultaneously undermined by another relationship. He saw what it cost her. He heard what she said privately about the specific pain of being in a marriage where her husband's primary emotional allegiance lay elsewhere. He also watched the institutional response to Diana's suffering, the management of her position inside the royal family as the marriage collapsed, the decisions made by people around Charles and Camilla that Diana documented in her own private writing, and that people close to her have described across multiple accounts over the years. Spencer absorbed all of it. He filed it in the place where people file things they cannot act on immediately, but intend never to forget. He never forgot. His public acceptance of Camilla's eventual integration into the royal family was exactly that. Public and acceptance in the formal sense only. He did not attend Charles and Camilla's wedding in April 2005. That absence was noted at the time, and he did not explain it publicly in terms that left room for misinterpretation. The absence said what it said. In the years following the wedding, as Camilla's position within the institution became more established, Spencer maintained his distance without creating open conflict. He appeared at events where their paths crossed with the specific civility that well-bred people deploy when they are in the same room as someone they hold in low regard and have decided not to confront publicly. That civility had a limit. Most people who knew Spencer understood that it had a limit. They simply did not know what the specific circumstances would be that pushed him past it. They found out at a gathering in the spring of 2026 that nobody involved will forget for the rest of their lives. What made Spencer's eventual confrontation so significant was not just what he said. It was the years of silence that preceded it, nearly 30 years of watching, of attending events where Camilla occupied space that Spencer believed, in the most private corners of his grief, his sister should have occupied, of sitting through tributes and ceremonies and official occasions where the version of the royal family presented to the public was one that had been carefully constructed to make Diana's story feel like a chapter that had been closed and moved on from. Spencer had never moved on from it. And the gathering in 2026 was the moment he decided that pretending otherwise was something he was no longer willing to do. What happened in that room, and why it produced the reaction it produced from Catherine, begins with understanding what the gathering was and who had brought all of these people into the same space on the same afternoon. The gathering that changed everything. The occasion was a private memorial service held at Althorp House in Northamptonshire in late April 2026. Althorp is the Spencer family estate. It is where Diana grew up. It is where she is buried, on a small island in the middle of an ornamental lake on the grounds of the property. It is, in every sense that matters, Spencer territory. A place where the family that raised Diana has always held the authority, and where the rules of engagement are set by the people who own the ground everyone else is standing on. The service had been organized to mark the approaching 30th anniversary of Diana's death, not a public event, not something announced to the press or open to the wider circle of people who attend official royal commemorations. A private gathering of people who had been personally connected to Diana and who had been invited specifically by Spencer himself. That invitation list was the first signal that the afternoon would not be straightforward. The decision to include members of the current royal family in the invitation had not been automatic. Spencer had considered carefully who should be present at a private memorial on his family's land. He had thought about what the gathering was meant to be and what it was meant to achieve. He had thought about Diana and what she would have wanted from the people who loved her when they came together to remember her. He had invited William and Catherine. That decision reflected his relationship with his nephews, which has always been warmer than his relationship with the institution they belong to. William is Diana's son. His presence at a memorial for his mother on the grounds where she is buried needed no justification. He had also, after a period of consideration that sources describe as genuinely difficult, extended an invitation to Charles and Camilla. The reasoning behind that decision has been described by people close to Spencer as complex. He believed that excluding Charles entirely would have been a statement that overshadowed the purpose of the gathering. Charles had loved Diana in his way, however inadequately that love had been expressed during their marriage. He was the father of her children. His absence would have become the story, rather than Diana herself. Camilla's invitation was the more complicated one. Spencer extended it because excluding her while including Charles would have created a different kind of statement, one that he was not prepared to make through the mechanism of a guest list rather than through words. He intended to make his statement through words. The afternoon began with the quiet formality that private memorial services tend to have. Approximately 40 people gathered in the main reception rooms at Althorp before moving to the grounds for the lakeside element of the commemoration. Family members, close friends of Diana's from different periods of her life. A small number of people who had worked closely with her on the charitable causes she had championed. The atmosphere was, by the accounts of several people present, genuinely moving in its early stages. People who had not seen each other in years reconnected over shared memories of Diana. Stories were told that the public had never heard. A picture of the private person, the Diana who existed outside the photographs and the official engagements, emerged in the conversations happening across the rooms. Catherine was visibly affected by those conversations from early in the afternoon. She had never met Diana. She came into William's life years after his mother's death. But she had spent years hearing about Diana from William and from the people who had known her, and the experience of being in the house where Diana had grown up, surrounded by people who had actually known her, carried a weight that Catherine did not attempt to conceal. William stayed close to her throughout the early part of the afternoon. He was navigating his own complicated emotional landscape at Althorp, as he always does when he is in spaces directly connected to his mother's life. And the two of them moved through the gathering with the specific mutual attentiveness of two people who know each other well enough to hold each other steady without making it visible. Charles and Camilla arrived together, as they always do at formal occasions. Their arrival shifted the atmosphere in the room in a way that several people present have described consistently. Not dramatically, the change was subtle. The specific adjustment that happens in a space when people who carry complicated histories with each other are suddenly occupying the same room. Spencer greeted them at the door. He was courteous. He was the host, and he conducted himself as a host when people whose presence he had invited, but whose company he did not welcome, arrived at his door. He showed them in. He ensured they were comfortable. He moved through the early part of the afternoon, performing the social functions that the occasion required of him. People who know Spencer well and who were present describe him as unusually quiet during this period, not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. The quiet of someone who was waiting for the right moment to say the thing he had come prepared to say. That moment arrived approximately 90 minutes into the gathering, when the group had moved outside to the lakeside area for the formal commemorative element of the afternoon. The setting made everything that followed feel more significant than it might have in a different space. Diana's grave is on a small island in the middle of the round oval lake at Althorp. Visitors to the memorial cannot reach the island itself. They stand at the edge of the water and look across at the grave from a respectful distance. The arrangement creates a specific intimacy. People standing together at the water's edge, looking across at the place where someone they loved is buried, with nowhere to look but at each other and at the water and at the grave on the other side. It is not a space that allows for the social maneuvering that large rooms permit. There is no easy way to drift to the other side of a gathering or to lose yourself in a conversation that removes you from whatever is happening in the main group. Everyone who was standing at that lakeside was standing together, and Spencer, standing at the edge of the water with the grave of his sister visible across it, made the decision that the moment had arrived. He began to speak. What Spencer said and how Camilla received it. He did not raise his voice. That detail matters more than almost anything else about what happened at the lakeside that afternoon. Because the assumption most people make when they imagine a confrontation of this nature is that it would involve the kind of elevated emotion that makes scenes dramatic in the obvious sense. Spencer's confrontation was not dramatic in the obvious sense. It was considerably more effective than that. He spoke in the measured, deliberate tone of someone who had been preparing what he wanted to say for a very long time, and had decided that the words themselves were sufficient without any additional performance layered on top of them. He began by speaking about Diana directly, which disarmed the room before anyone understood what was coming. He talked about what Althorp had meant to her as a child, and about the specific quality of freedom she had experienced on these grounds before the world decided what she was going to be. He talked about the girl who had grown up running across this land and who had never entirely lost the version of herself that existed here before everything else happened. The people standing at the water's edge were moved by those opening words in the way that people are moved when someone speaks about a person they loved with genuine knowledge of who that person actually was. Several people present have described feeling the specific quality of grief that surfaces when you hear someone articulate something true about someone you have lost. Catherine was among those people. She was standing close enough to William that their arms were touching, and people who were watching her during Spencer's opening remarks describe her expression as one of quiet, absorbed emotion. Then Spencer turned. He did not make a theatrical gesture of it. He simply shifted his body so that he was no longer speaking to the group generally, but addressing a specific part of it, and the people standing near Camilla understood immediately what was happening even before he said her name. He said her name clearly, and without the softening that social convention typically places around a direct address in a formal setting. He told her that he had spent nearly 30 years being courteous in situations that did not deserve his courtesy, and that he had decided, standing at his sister's grave, that he was no longer willing to perform a civility that he did not feel toward a person whose role in Diana's suffering he had never forgotten and would never minimize. He was not shouting. He was not gesturing. He was simply stating, in complete and carefully constructed sentences, something that he had been carrying for 3 decades and had chosen this specific moment and this specific location to finally put down. The specific content of what Spencer said has not been fully reproduced in any public account of the gathering. Several people who were present have described it in consistent general terms without providing a verbatim account, which reflects both the private nature of the occasion and the specific sensitivity of what was said about living people in a context that was not designed for public consumption. What has been described consistently is that Spencer spoke about the years of Diana's marriage with a directness that went beyond anything he had said publicly before. He spoke about what Diana had told him during that period, about the specific conversations they had had as siblings when she was trying to navigate a situation that was destroying her. and about the role that Camilla's relationship with Charles had played in creating the conditions that made Diana's experience inside the royal family as painful as it was. He spoke about the decision not to attend the wedding in 2005 and about what that decision had represented. He said that he had made it not as a statement for public consumption, but as a private act of loyalty to his sister that he had never regretted and did not intend to apologize for. He spoke about the public rehabilitation of Camilla's image across the 2 decades since the wedding, and about the degree to which that rehabilitation had required the simultaneous management of Diana's legacy in ways that Spencer found, in his words, dishonest. Camilla stood through all of it without interrupting. People who were watching her during Spencer's remarks describe her composure as remarkable in the specific way that Camilla's composure is always remarkable, which is to say that it was clearly costing her something, but that the cost was not visible on her face in any way that gave Spencer or anyone else a readable response to work with. She did not look away from him. She held his gaze with the specific steadiness of someone who has spent decades preparing for versions of this moment, and who had decided, consciously or instinctively, that looking away or showing distress would be a form of concession she was not prepared to make. When Spencer finished speaking, there was a silence at the lakeside that several people present have described as one of the most uncomfortable they have experienced in a social setting. Charles stood slightly apart from Camilla during the remarks, and his expression during Spencer's address has been described by different people in terms that are consistent with each other. He looked, by multiple accounts, like a man who understood that what was happening was not something he could stop, and who had decided that attempting to stop it would make everything worse than allowing it to reach its conclusion. Camilla spoke when the silence had held long enough that not speaking would have been its own statement. She did not raise her voice either. She spoke in the same measured register that Spencer had used, which created the specific quality of exchange that happens when 2 people who are both exercising enormous control over their emotional responses engage directly with each other in a public setting. She acknowledged that Spencer had every right to feel what he felt. She said that she had never expected his forgiveness and had never asked for it. She said that she understood his love for Diana and that she did not stand in the way of it. What she did not do was apologize. What she did not do was offer any account of her own actions or motivations during the years Spencer had spoken about. What she did not do was engage with the specific content of his remarks about Diana's suffering and Camilla's role in it. She responded to the emotional reality of his grief without engaging with the historical substance of his accusations. Several people present found that response more telling than any direct answer would have been. William stood very still throughout the entire exchange. He had watched his mother's brother confront his father's wife at his mother's graveside, and the specific impossibility of that position, of being someone who loved everyone in this equation in different ways and for different reasons, was visible to the people who were watching him, even as he worked to keep it contained. He did not intervene. He did not move toward Spencer or toward Camilla. He held his position at the water's edge and absorbed what was happening with the same discipline he brings to every public situation that asks more of him than any person should reasonably be asked to give. Catherine was standing beside him, and what happened to her during and after Spencer's remarks is the part of this story that nobody present had anticipated and that changed the atmosphere of the gathering in ways that even Spencer's confrontation had not. Catherine's moment. Catherine has always been composed in public situations that would break most people. She has stood beside William at events memorializing Diana, knowing that the grief in the room was real and deep and connected to a woman she never met, but whose absence has shaped every aspect of the life she stepped into. She has navigated the specific complexity of being the woman who came after Diana, who wears the sapphire ring that Diana wore, who occupies the role that Diana occupied, without ever allowing that complexity to surface in any way that the public could point to and call a moment of weakness. Her composure is not performance. People who know her describe it as genuinely constitutional, a quality of self-regulation that runs deep enough that it holds even under sustained pressure. What happened at the lakeside broke through it. She did not cry during Spencer's remarks themselves. People who were watching her during the confrontation describe her expression as one of concentrated, absorbing attention. She was listening in the way that people listen when something is being said that connects to feelings they have carried privately for a long time, without a public language to express them. Catherine had never met Diana, That fact is one that she has lived with across every year of her relationship with William, across the engagement and the wedding, and the years of building a family together. Always aware that the person whose memory shaped everything about the man she married was someone she could never actually know. She had built her understanding of Diana from what William told her, from the accounts of people who had known Diana personally, from the record that exists in photographs and footage, and the written testimony of people who had been close to her. She had constructed a picture of Diana from everything available to her, except the one thing that would have made that picture complete, which was the experience of actually being in the same room as her. At Althorp, standing at the edge of the water with Diana's grave visible across it, Catherine was as close to Diana as she had ever been. Spencer finished speaking, and Camilla responded, and the exchange reached its conclusion. And for a moment, the group at the lakeside stood in the specific quiet of people who have just witnessed something significant and have not yet processed what it means or what comes next. It was in that quiet that Catherine's composure broke. It did not break dramatically in the way that public crying is sometimes depicted. There was no sound. There was no collapse or visible distress that required anyone to intervene or to redirect the afternoon around her. Her eyes filled and the tears came, and the people standing near her saw it and understood immediately what they were seeing, which was not a woman who had been upset by the confrontation in the way that a bystander might be upset by witnessing conflict. They were seeing a woman whose grief for a person she had never met had finally found a moment where it did not need to be managed. William saw it first. He turned to her with the specific attentiveness of someone who has been watching the person beside him carefully enough to catch the moment before it becomes visible to the wider group. He reached for her hand and she took it, and several people who witnessed that exchange have described it as one of the most quietly affecting moments of the entire afternoon. There was no conversation between them that anyone overheard. There was no gesture of comfort beyond the hand that he offered and that she held. But the specific quality of that connection between a man grieving his mother at her grave and the woman who loved him and wished she had known the person whose absence made him who he is, communicated something that words would have been inadequate to express. Catherine has spoken publicly about Diana in carefully measured terms across the years of her royal life. She has praised Diana's legacy. She has engaged with Diana's charitable work and sought to continue aspects of it in her own way. She has been deliberate and thoughtful about how she honors someone she never met, without overstepping the boundaries of what it is appropriate to claim about a person whose experience she did not share. What she had never done publicly before this afternoon at Althorp was allow the grief of not having known Diana to be visible. Spencer was the person who reached her next. After the immediate group had absorbed what was happening and the natural human response of giving someone space had created a brief ring of quiet around Catherine and William, Spencer moved toward them. He did not say anything that anyone present has been willing to reproduce in any account of the afternoon. What has been described is the gesture that accompanied whatever he said, which was that he took Catherine's free hand, the one that William was not holding, and held it briefly in both of his own. The significance of that gesture was not lost on anyone at the lakeside. Spencer, who had just delivered the most direct public confrontation of Camilla that anyone connected to the royal family has offered in nearly 3 decades, turned immediately afterward to the woman who would one day be queen and offered her a connection to Diana that only someone who had actually known Diana could offer. He was telling her, without words, that her grief was legitimate, that the love she carried for a woman she had never met was something Diana's own brother recognized and honored. Catherine's tears continued for several minutes after that exchange, and nobody at the lakeside attempted to redirect the afternoon or to move things along in a way that would have required her to compose herself before she was ready. The afternoon held space for her in the way that occasions sometimes do when something is true and unplanned surfaces and the people present have the grace to let it be what it is. Charles watched all of it from a short distance. His position at the lakeside during the minutes that followed Spencer's confrontation and Catherine's response has been described by people present as one of visible and contained anguish. He is a man who loved Diana in his way, who has carried his own complicated grief about what happened in their marriage and how it ended, and who stood at her grave watching his sister-in-law offer his daughter-in-law the kind of direct human connection to Diana that his own choices had made it impossible for him to offer in the same unambiguous way. Camilla stood beside him, and the space between them and the rest of the group at the lakeside had widened in the way that spaces widen when an exchange has changed the atmosphere of a gathering in ways that physical proximity cannot fully bridge. The afternoon did not end immediately after these moments. People moved back toward the house. Conversations resumed in the careful way that conversations resume after something significant has happened and everyone present is still processing what they witnessed. But something had changed at Althorp that afternoon in ways that would not change back. Spencer had said what he had been carrying for 30 years, and Catherine had wept for a woman she had never known. And the royal family had stood at the edge of the water and absorbed both of those things in a setting where there was nowhere to go and nothing to do but feel the full weight of what the afternoon had produced. The fallout no one could contain. The gathering at Althorp ended in the early evening, and the cars that carried the royal family away from the estate moved through the Northamptonshire countryside, in a silence that nobody inside them attempted to fill with conversation. The afternoon had produced something that did not compress easily into the ordinary management of difficult royal occasions. There was no press office framework for what had happened at the lakeside. There was no palace communications protocol designed to handle the specific situation of a senior royal confronted publicly by the brother of his deceased former wife at a private memorial on the grounds where that wife was buried. The people whose job it was to manage these things were, by every account from people familiar with the immediate aftermath, operating without a clear playbook. The palace's first response was silence, which is typically what the institution reaches for when something has happened that it does not yet know how to characterize. No statement was issued in the hours following the gathering. No royal spokesman was briefed to provide context or framing for what had occurred. The communications teams connected to the various households represented at Althorp that afternoon maintained the specific quiet that signals an institution absorbing something significant before it decides how to respond. That silence lasted approximately 48 hours before the story began to surface in the press through the accounts of people who had been present and who had concluded that what they had witnessed was too significant to remain entirely contained within the private circle of those who had been at Althorp. When the story did surface, it moved quickly and it moved widely in the way that stories involving Diana always move when they carry the specific combination of emotional weight and institutional significance that this one carried. Spencer did not speak to the press in the immediate aftermath of the gathering. He returned to his own life after the memorial with the same deliberate quiet that had characterized his decision to speak at the lakeside. He had said what he intended to say in the setting he had chosen for the specific reason that it was his ground and his occasion and his sister's grave, and he did not feel the need to amplify or extend what had happened by engaging with the media attention that followed. People close to Spencer describe his mood in the days after Althorp as one of settled resolution, rather than the kind of anxiety that typically follows a public confrontation of significant consequence. He had made a decision that he had been building toward for nearly 3 decades, and the experience of finally making it had produced in him something closer to relief than regret. He had spoken for Diana at her eulogy in 1997, and he had spoken for her again at her grave in 2026, and both times he had said what he believed was true without apologizing for saying it. Camilla's response to what had happened became visible in the days following the gathering through the specific mechanisms that senior royals use when they want to communicate something without making an official statement. She canceled 2 engagements in the week after Althorp, with her office citing private reasons that were not elaborated upon. The cancellations were noted by royal correspondents who tracked the schedules of working royals with forensic attention, and who understood that the timing connected them to what had happened at the memorial, even in the absence of any official confirmation. Sources close to Camilla described the days following Althorp as some of the most difficult she had experienced since the years immediately following Diana's death, when the public hostility toward her had been at its most intense and most personal. The confrontation at the lakeside had reopened something that she had spent 2 decades working to move past, and the setting in which it had happened, at Diana's grave, on Spencer's land, in front of the people who had loved Diana most directly, had given it a weight that a similar exchange in any other context would not have carried. She spoke to Charles at length in the evenings following the gathering, and those conversations have been described by people familiar with their content as honest in a way that the couple's private conversations are not always able to be when the subject matter is Diana and everything connected to her. William's processing of what had happened at Althorp took a form that people close to him describe as characteristic of how he handles emotional events of significant complexity. He did not discuss it publicly. He did not allow anyone around him to brief journalists about his response or his feelings about what Spencer had said and what Catherine's reaction had meant to him. He absorbed the afternoon and carried it in the private way that he carries most things that touch the most complicated parts of his emotional life. What was visible in the days after Althorp was a change in the quality of his public presence that people who know him well recognized without being able to point to a specific behavior that accounted for it. He was, by multiple accounts, quieter than usual in settings where his presence was required, more inward than the public version of himself that official engagements demand. Catherine was the person who understood best what the afternoon had cost him, because she had been standing beside him throughout it, and because the years they had spent together had given her a fluency in his emotional landscape that made the things he did not say as readable to her as the things he did. The longer-term consequences of what happened at Althorp are still being understood by the people most directly affected by them. Spencer's confrontation did not produce any formal institutional response. The palace did not issue a statement addressing what he had said. No official position was taken on the substance of his remarks about Camilla or about Diana's experience inside the royal family. The institution absorbed the event in the way that it absorbs most things that threaten to complicate the version of itself it presents to the public, which is to say that it did not engage with it directly and waited for the immediate attention to pass. But the things that were said at the lakeside did not pass in the way that publicly managed statements pass when the news cycle moves on. They were said at Diana's grave by the person who had stood at her funeral and told the world that the institution that had failed to protect her would not be allowed to fail the people she left behind. They were heard by 40 people who had gathered specifically because they had loved Diana and who carried what they heard back into their own lives and their own relationships, with the memory of a woman whose absence continued to shape everything connected to the royal family in ways that no amount of institutional management had been able to fully contain. Catherine carries something different from Althorp than she carried to it. She arrived at that gathering as she has arrived at every occasion connected to Diana's memory, with the careful, composed respect of someone honoring a person she never knew and whose legacy she inhabits without being able to claim it as her own. She left with something more personal than respect. She left with the specific knowledge that Diana's brother, the man who had stood at Diana's funeral and refused to let the institution erase what had been done to his sister, had looked at Catherine and seen something worth honoring with the same directness he had always reserved for things he considered genuinely important. He had held her hand at his sister's grave, and in doing so, he had given her something that no official occasion or formal acknowledgement of Diana's legacy had ever been able to provide. He had told her, in the only language that moment allowed, that the grief she carried for a woman she had never met was real enough to deserve recognition from the person who had known that woman better than almost anyone. Catherine wept at Althorp because something true surfaced in a place where the truth about Diana had always lived more honestly than anywhere else. And Charles Spencer, who had spent 30 years waiting for the right moment to say what he needed to say, had chosen the one setting where everything he said would be impossible to dismiss, impossible to manage away, and impossible to forget. He had chosen his sister's grave, and the afternoon that followed will remain, for everyone who was present at the water's edge that day, the most honest moment any of them had shared inside the long and complicated story of a family that has never fully reckoned with what Diana's life and death actually cost. Charles Spencer waited nearly 30 years to say what he said at that lakeside. He chose his sister's grave because there was no more honest place to say it, and no setting where the words could be more easily dismissed or managed away by the people who had spent decades doing exactly that. Camilla stood through every word with the composure that 30 years of survival inside this institution had built in her, and she offered a response that acknowledged the grief without engaging with the history that produced it. And Catherine, the future queen, who never knew Diana, wept at the water's edge because something true finally had room to surface in a place where Diana had always been most honestly remembered. Spencer gave her that. He gave her a hand to hold and a moment of recognition that no official occasion had ever provided. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. There is considerably more coming.